Hello, welcome everyone. I think we're going to get started here. The name of our talk is Targeted Malware, Sophisticated Criminals, or Babytown Frolics. A little bit about who we are. I'm Ryan. This is my photobombing co-conspirator, Josh. We spend most of our days dissecting malware. When we do get some free time, though, we've delved into the ancient arts of homebrewing, which I hear is a big hobby around here as well. So if people want to swap secrets and you're into that sort of thing, hit us up afterwards. We love chatting about it. A little bit about what we do. We work for Trustwave Spider Labs. Spider Labs is like the advanced security group within Trustwave. We're responsible for doing things such as like penetration testing, AppSec reviews, forensics, research. We're part of the research team, but we work very closely with our forensics investigators who did something in the number of 300 to 400 breach incident responses last year. So we see a lot of real-world malware. They send it back to us. We dissect it, give them analysis back so they can continue with their job.
Yeah. So, you know, a lot of times when we're talking to friends, family, coworkers, you know, security folk, people are always asking, you know, what is it you see? Because we do have a certain sort of interesting insight. We get to see real malware that's used in actual breaches, you know, often breaches that you don't hear about in the news because, well, US laws being what they are. But, you know, when we're talking to these guys, these people, it always seems to come back to a certain, you know, trifecta, if you will, of topics, and that is things like Stuxnet and Flame and Dooku and, you know, the classic big hitters that you see in the media, and they always seem to, you know, it paints this picture of sort of this super spy criminal, this crazy malware author that's out in some secret agency, you know, hacking up like, you know, Swordfish or one of those classic movies. And that was kind of the inspiration for this talk, right? Because we see this stuff and we really wanted to answer the question, is it just crazy over the top, you know, state-sponsored, APT, you know, whatever buzzword you want to use, or is it the opposite? Is it Babytown Frolics, or any Archer fans here? You guys get Archer, right? Okay. That could have gone horribly wrong. Right, so all you mean is it amateur? Is it silly? Is it something that we laugh about over beers the following night? So that's kind of the main goal of this talk. We got 4 case studies. I'm pretty excited. We're going to talk not only about the malware, because that's kind of our passion. We love digging into the tech there. We're going to talk about what techniques are these guys using, how are they getting the data, how are they exfiltrating it, things like that. But we're also going to kind of take a second to talk about the people behind it. Are they crazy smart people, or are they kind of just, I don't know, idiots finding stuff on forums that they don't even know what it does, but they're running it to see what happens? So, before we kind of kick things off, we do have a couple sort of housekeeping items. We want to kind of define what targeted is, because it's kind of a word that gets thrown out a lot. It's got a lot of different meanings based on who you talk to, right? And for us, it's kind of got 2 sides to it. The first one being kind of straightforward, and that is targeting an organization. I hate to pick on them, but I'm going to use them as an example. Sony, you know, I don't know if you heard, but they actually got hacked about a year ago. So right, like it didn't matter necessarily what data these guys were getting, so long as it was part of the sort of Sony umbrella. Conversely, the other way we kind of refer to targeted is not so much the organization, but the data itself. Credit cards are kind of a great example for this one. We'll see instances where attackers are compromising systems and ignoring 80% of the data because all they care about is credit cards. They don't care about the passwords on the system or, I don't know, emails that might be stored there or anything else. All they care about is credit cards, so that's all they target. That's all they look at. We do have to anonymize certain things. In a lot of cases, these are ongoing investigations with law enforcement who we cooperate with, so we don't want to get fired or arrested, so we have to take certain precautions. We have to change, you know, a couple things just to make sure that if you're one of the authors in the audience or on the video or whatever, that you can't necessarily tell what we're talking about if it's yours.
Yeah, protect the innocent and not tip off the hands of the guilty.
Right. And then, of course, going back to it, we are talking about, are they smart or are they dumb? And we're going to kind of summarize each case at the end, each case study, and kind of go back to that main point. Were these guys really smart, or were they making money? We're going to kind of summarize all that towards the end. So,
All right, let's jump right in. We have 4 case studies, so we want to try to get through this quickly as we can. The first one is called Sandy Squirrel. Don't read too deeply into the names that we chose. We were just having some fun over some pints. So the first target here is a point of sale system. Specifically, what's being targeted here is the card holder data. Method of compromise is no surprise if you follow these types of things. Remote access software is by far the way people get into these types of environments. A little bit about the malware characteristics themselves that we found here. We found multiple pieces of malware on a single system. They were related, and we'll talk about that. No obfuscation. Everything was kind of face value. They weren't trying to hide from us in any way. And there was some exfiltration involved here, but it was very limited. So jump right into it. So just kind of paint a picture here. We have our victim point of sale system. This is like where the aggregate of cardholder data is coming through and being processed. This is kind of like the keys to the kingdom when it comes to attackers. This is where they want to be. So the first thing you see here is the first piece of malware specifically targeting cardholder data in a specific format. There was yet another one that was kind of a recon tool, which means it's something that you would typically run once, get a little bit of information, and make decisions based on that output. But what they had done is put it into a batch script loop, and we're running it over and over and over. That's not the way this tool was meant to be run, but that's how they were handling it. Yet another memory scraper. Again, these are all so far targeting RAM, running memory. This one was targeting another format. This recon tool, actually it seems that they were using it right, but they might have actually, don't put it past them, I'm sure they found a way to run this one incorrectly. And then lastly, this one's a little bit different. This one was a commercial product that was actually targeting the disk itself, hard drive. So that one was a little different from the other 4. And then lastly, of all these pieces of malware that were running on this one system, only this one here, targeting wide format strings, was actually exfiltrating any data out of the network back to the bad guys. So that's an interesting setup.
So, in case you haven't figured it out, these guys really loved memory scrapers to a fault, in a sense. And we'll explain why it was to a fault later on. But I think it's kind of interesting to talk about how these guys work kind of on the coding level, right? Because it's something that a lot of people don't often see. It's a very specific type of malware that, frankly, is really more or less only really prevalent in sort of this situation. So at kind of a high level, it's more or less a 5-step process, right? I'll just kind of step through these. The first one being, the attackers have to enumerate what processes are on the system. How are they, what are they going to go after? They're going to go after everything, or just, a single process. Once they find out what they want to look at, they get a handle to that process, iterate through its memory, read it, and do something with it. Maybe they want to dump it to disk. Maybe they want to throw like a regular expression against it. Maybe they're morons and they just shove it all over the internet and see what happens. So specifically for the kind of first step here, the enumerating process or processes or processes, whatever. Process I. There's typically 2 techniques, not only in this specific kind of case study, but also I think Ryan would agree with me overall. We see more or less the same, 2 ways that this is being accomplished. These are both just regular Windows API calls. The first one being enum processes, process I. And it's very straightforward, right? All it's doing, you run it, and you get a list of all the process identifiers or PIDs, and that's literally all it does. The second one, create tool help 32 snapshot. Not only being a mouthful to say, also gives the attacker a lot more information, right? This is given not only the specified processes on the system, but also things like the heaps, the modules, the threads, the process executable name, all sorts of stuff. And it takes a little bit more work to kind of get at that data, but obviously it's a bit more rich. You get a little bit more. So that's kind of like my little spiel on that. So jumping to the end of the kind of setup here.
Yeah, so at the end, now we've enumerated the processes. What do we do? Across the board, when we're looking at cardholder data being targeted, we see regular expressions being used or misused. We see them in if anyone's tried to write a regular expression, it can be a little tricky at times, right? So we've picked 3 different regular expressions that were used within these malware that were on this particular system, and we're going to kind of talk about them. This first one is not a mistake. I didn't fall asleep on the keyboard. It was literally a \question mark, which is literally a question mark, right? And what the attacker was probably trying to go for is that question marks are used as a sentinel within track data. So they're trying to find those sentinel items. Yeah, that's true. But what else doesn't match? Pretty much natural language, right? I mean, if you have a process that's running an email client, you're going to get a lot of false positives with it. This next one I have here in the crayon font, due to the fact that it's pretty simple. I was actually working with the forensics investigator on this particular case, and he was asking me how are they targeting the memory. And once we found this little guy, I let him know, and he started laughing. He said, you know, is this written in crayon in the binary? So I put that up there in crayon font for him.
You guys are coming out with a book, right?
Yeah. Oh yeah. So we put our heads together. We're going to start a children's book, and we're going to call it Baby's First Regex, and this is going to be the highlight. So just kind of talk about what it is. 15 to 19 digits, followed by an equal sign, followed by 13 or more digits. So what does it match? This is kind of probably what they were hoping for, right? What does it also match? Well, any sufficiently long length of digits with an embedded equal sign in it and the following digits. So if you could find an equal sign, you're going to get some false positives here. Not as many as obviously the first one, but this one you're going to see some false positives. And this last one is pretty clear, right? Everyone understands we don't need to talk about it, right? Yeah, this one is a little bit more complex. It's got some conditionals in here happening, so it's very specific. This guy's gone kind of the other way. It's actually targeting a much more of the track data itself, actually to a fault. So what it doesn't match here is entire portions. If you can't read it, it's just saying it misses parts of American Express. This is specifically targeting things like Amex, some of the Amex, Visa, and MasterCard specifically. So it's going to miss a lot of other things versus lots of false positives. So that's kind of an example of 3 different regular expressions.
So you might recall in the beginning we said that there was one sample that was actually exfiltrating data. So how are they actually doing this, right? Well, in this case, it was very straightforward. They just exfiltrated via a post request, all unencrypted. You know, it's just out in the clear. So if any network admin was sniffing the network, he would have seen this clear as day. At least I hope. Something interesting to note, though, is you might see the post data here being, you know, track 1 and track 2. This is the max amount of data that will be exfiltrated in a single request, which is important because it only makes one request every 60 seconds. So you get one credit card number, and then you wait a minute, and then you get one credit card number, and the process kind of continues. Now, we've seen a lot of exfiltration, and I think this might actually win the award for being the worst exfiltration we've seen, at least for this year. So that's kind of something to note. So you might also recall that we mentioned that a commercial product was in use. Now, this isn't uncommon. We'll often see commercial products being used by attackers, but typically it's things like keyloggers, you know, Spectre keylogger, Perfect keylogger. There's a number of them, and these guys love them because they're easy and they work, and a lot of times they exfiltrate data. Now, in this case, it's probably hard to read, but this is a tool called Card Recon. Now, there's this thing called PCI, right? Payment card industry. And it's basically to, you know, ensure that your credit cards don't get stolen. It's pretty much foolproof. Everyone that's PCI compliant never gets hacked. So this tool is actually designed to assist. Basically, PCI says you're not supposed to have unencrypted cards on your hard disk, which, you know, is good. So this tool is used to identify, you know, presumably so the good guys could ensure that this isn't happening. These guys found a cracked version. It's all over, if you are so inclined to look, out on the interweb. And they used it kind of flip-flopped, right? They used it to find data that they could then steal. So that's kind of interesting. That's the first time we've actually seen a tool of this sort in use. So I mentioned, you know, we're going to kind of summarize everything. We've got certain sort of static plots here. So we've got the coup de grace references, you know, Stuxnet, Flame, and Gauss. These guys are making lots of, you know, money or profit.
Headwinds, yeah.
Mm-hmm. But then you got things, and they're very sophisticated. But then you've also got things like, you know, everyone's favorite group, Anonymous, who are DDoSing everyone, and I mean, they're just kind of doing it for kicks, more or less. So let's kind of summarize what the malware was doing, right? From a Frolics standpoint or an amateur standpoint, I mean, if it hasn't been clear already, this is pretty weak stuff. The exfiltration was bar none the worst we've seen. The malware, they had multiple pieces of malware, more or less all doing the same thing. And the beauty of it was, I mentioned that it was to a fault, right? The beauty of it was that we saw in certain cases where one memory scraper would inject into another memory scraper, and it kind of inceptionized everything. So, you know, that was interesting.
Yeah, and I guess from a sophisticated spy tactics, there are none.
So they did get in, right? I guess you got to give them credit for that. So let's actually take a look at kind of the y-axis here. How much profit did they get? How long were they there? And in this case, we've actually got, it's pretty weak. They were only there for about 2 weeks. They got caught. They got kicked out. Actually, I mean, you think 2 weeks is pretty bad, but actually this is a really short time frame for this kind of a case. And of course, with the exfiltration capabilities being what they were, they really didn't get a lot of data. They didn't get a lot of money. Just based on looking at the malware itself. So it was pretty weak. So, where should we plot these, Ryan?
Yeah, well, based on that, that's going to be down the lower left.
Yeah. So, you know, it's good, right? Because you expect dumb people to not get much money.
Right?
It's good. So, moving on.
The universe is making sense right now.
Yeah. So this is actually probably my favorite of the four, and we named it Secret Shenanigans, and in this case it was actually a defense contractor back in the States. And the method of compromise, well, we're not terribly sure, but we believe it was some sort of malicious document, right? Some sort of PDF or Word doc that was used to, you know, spearfish these guys and gain access to the environment. The malware, a bit different this time. We're actually looking at Rootkit stuff with custom injectors. It's all looking at intellectual property. These guys, we don't have it on the list here, but they're actually encrypting their data. They're exfiltrating via a third-party hosting service, so there's kind of a lot going on. Now, this might be trivial for some of you, but before we dig into like Rootkit stuff, or before Ryan does, we do have to kind of make sure everyone's on the same level. Now, when you run code on an operating system, it's going to run in one of two modes, user mode or kernel mode. Kernel mode being kind of the bee's knees, if you will. It's the greatest. It's got, you know, all privileges that you'd want. There's no limitations there. User mode, kind of flip side, there's certain restrictions where you can't do as many things as you would, say, if you're in kernel. The other side to it, though, is that kernel mode, you know, things like drivers typically don't have access to certain high-level Windows API calls. So if you're looking to, you know, make an outbound call via TCP or something, it's kind of difficult from that context. And this is kind of where user mode shines, which is kind of important, right? Because as you'll see in just a second.
Right, so our rootkit kind of wants to live in the best of both rings. And to do that, it uses something called APC Injection in this case. So kind of stick with me here. Asynchronous procedure call, meaning it's not being called in linear time, it's waiting for a certain event. The specific event in this case we're looking for is called an alertable state. Once we get into that state, that's when our code will execute, I mean. We're also looking to target specific processes that run within Windows that we see all the time, services.exe and svchost.exe. These are particular processes that commonly come into that state that we're looking for where our code will be executed. So our rootkit, graphically here, we can look at it, we'll be injecting from kernel mode over into user mode within the context of this process, within services.exe, the process, and then a specific thread. Each thread has its own APC queue. So kind of a quick blow up from idle dump here. We have our services.exe. We initialize our APC, pass arguments, and then insert the code. At this point, the code will be executing within user mode, and we can kind of have the best of both worlds, so to speak. So we're thinking, wow, this is some pretty cool stuff, right? So we started doing our due diligence, and as we're researching the techniques being used here, we came up with a website here from 2006, and we're like, whoa, I guess this has been around for a while. It's not unknown, but it's definitely not super common knowledge. But as we started looking at it, we saw a lot of similarities, and you don't need to be able to read all this here, just showing that the website exists. And so we started looking at this like, well, maybe these guys aren't so advanced after all. Maybe these guys aren't so elite. Maybe they're just doing a copy-paste job, right? So as we started to dig in further, we started to see there's quite a few tweaks being done to the code that we found online. And due to the fact that the code was so old, it looked like to us that the changes that were made throughout were being made to support newer operating systems and to make it more reliable code. So now we kind of flipped back over and said, well, they're not doing a copy-paste job. They understand what's happening here. They're actually improving the code and using it without having to rewrite it, because I'm pretty lazy too, and I don't want to rewrite kernel code all the time. So that's the injector.
It was quite the emotional roller coaster ride where we weren't sure if these guys were actually knowing what they were doing or just, like Ryan said, copy-paste.
Right.
And as Ryan said, a lot of modifications were made. One of them, it's not terribly complex, but they were doing string obfuscation. Now, I got a lot of buddies on the pen test team, and we'll always have a good joke over some beers where, we start talking about assembly and reversing, and they say, yeah, my reversing knowledge pretty much ends after I run strings. And we have a laugh, and we drink some more beer, and then, but if you think about it, there's actually some truth to strings. You can get some good data there, right? You might get things like URLs, usernames, passwords, host names. There's potentially a lot of rich data. So, knowing this, these guys used a trivial obfuscation routine. They just XORed data, any string that they cared to hide. They XORed it using, in this case, the string of hex BE. And that resulted in that wonderful, illegible kind of hex array there, char array. And so what they do is then, whenever they need that string, they just XOR it again. That's the beauty of XOR. You do it once and you get garbage, you do it again, you get the original stuff. And that was kind of their way of making sure that if any pen tester got his hands on it and he ran strings against it. And if you're a pen tester, I'm not trying to say you don't know anything about reversing, I'm just for the example. That was their kind of way of approaching that issue. Now, these guys were also encrypting the data before they exfiltrated it, which was kind of cool. We saw, in this case, they're using Blowfish. I'm sure most of you guys are familiar with it. And when we're doing this sort of reversing and we're identifying things like, oh, they're using Blowfish and this is the key that's used and here's how you can decrypt it and all that, we oftentimes get looks of I've been told that it's magic and that it's just crazy. They don't understand how it works. But in reality, it's actually not terribly difficult. Blowfish in particular is kind of interesting. Its unique traits are it's got 4 S boxes, and a single P array. And all I mean is that it's got these static chunks of data. It's using the digits of pi to use them, just as a side. But it doesn't matter what language you're using. If you're using, I've got something with Python at the top there, the bottom's the actual code. If you use Python, you use Ruby, C, whatever your flavor is, you're going to need this data, these static chunks of data. Knowing this, we can simply just look in the binary and say, hey, does this data exist? Yeah, well, guess what? They're probably using Blowfish, or they might be. I mean, it's a good guess. So that was kind of just an interesting little note there.
Yeah, I mean, if you're a reverser and you're not using FindCrypt, that's a great plugin to use. It'll go through and find these static keys already for you.
Yeah, we didn't manually search the binary for this data, in case you're wondering. We're not that
88.6a. Yes.
We're not that elite, so we actually just automated it. Yeah. So exfiltration. First thing they're doing is encrypting the data, and from there, actually, just curious, is anybody here familiar with a third-party hosting service known as SendSpace? No? Dropbox? Does that? Okay. So SendSpace is pretty much just like Dropbox, right? It's a service that's really handy. It's got its own API for uploading files anonymously. It's got a really high cap for sizes. So I don't know off the top of my head, but I think it's, you can upload gigs of data, which is important because remember, this is a defense contractor. They might have really large amounts of good data. So what these guys are doing, they had 20 or so API keys that they just kind of cycled through, and they would, anonymously upload it to SendSpace. From there, SendSpace said, okay, cool, I got your file, and I'm gonna send an email to the email address that you specified saying, hey, your file's ready, here's the unique URL that you can use to download it. And then from there, of course, they could grab the link and download it at their leisure via Tor or some other service. So that was actually interesting. We hadn't seen too many uses of this service in the past, and the fact that they were kind of taking full advantage is kind of unique. So let's sum it up. From a Frolics standpoint or an amateur standpoint, we don't have too much here, right? They reuse code, but they kind of knew what they were doing, right? They actually improved on the code, so we can't really use that, right. I guess. But we had to put something, so
can't leave it blank.
Yeah.
String obfuscation. I mean, they're at least not in public view of everything. They are using a unique method of exfiltration that they can send out tons of data and kind of put that level of abstraction between the victim and themselves, which is great for them. And they're doing a rootkit, which is pretty great. I mean, I think that's sexy. So, I'm sorry, the malware sometimes does it for me. So, how long were they on this system? That's again not an error. We did the math. We added it up. 820 days, which is, as Josh was mentioning earlier, kind of why it was difficult to like trace back the initial infection method due to the fact that they were just on this system for so long. So from a profit standpoint, with that amount of time and that level of sophistication, we're going to go ahead and give them $3 signs out of $3 signs, right? I mean, they're on a defense contractor and they're running Rootkit undetected for 2.25 years.
Yeah, that was pretty bad. Right. So where do we throw these guys on the wonderful custom chart that we have? Well, you know, we're not going to stand up here and say this is Stuxnet or Flame or anything, but you know, we do feel that this is pretty sophisticated stuff. Obviously, they're making a lot of money. They're there for over 2 years. You might actually remember the one thing was from 2006, and at the time we were like, wow, this is crazy old. But then if you think about it, if they're actually writing this stuff like 3 years ago, it's actually not quite as bad, right? Because it's actually it makes more sense. So, third case. Let's move on. Pirate Piñata. It's actually very similar to the first case. We got another point of sale system, another instance of exposed remote desktop using default usernames and passwords. If you currently have a point of sale system, I implore you to change these usernames and passwords if you can. It's by far the most widely used way that these guys are getting in. From a malware perspective, this is kind of interesting. They were using stuff that we've seen time and time again. We've actually had coworkers get up on stage and present about the specific malware as far back as like 3 or 4 years ago. And it's still not getting detected. I think somebody had uploaded it to VirusTotal a few months ago, and I think it was at 2 detections out of 41. They also made heavy use of AutoIt, which if you don't know what that is, don't worry, Ryan's going to talk about it. Exfiltrating via email, SMTP. Again, still no reversing techniques. We're not seeing that. And obfuscation was kind of limited. In fact, it was actually really only a byproduct of using AutoIt, which is kind of interesting.
So just out of curiosity, how many people know AutoIt or have used AutoIt? Yeah, there's a decent number of people. I mean, these guys have been around since like '99, so they're not new to the scene. And basically what it is a scripting language. You don't have to be an expert programmer to use this. There's a lot of user-defined functions. But basically it allows you to script in this high-level language. It compiles down, and then you can create a standalone exe. You don't need extra runtimes or anything. It's pretty common among administrators that need to interact with like GUI like interfaces. So if you have a GUI interface, there's no command line version, you need to like move a mouse and make clicks, that sort of thing. This tool would do that. Then the gaming industry kind of picked up on it and used it to create bots to do their bidding, which is another common use now, probably more so than the way they legitimately wanted it to be used. But it supports the Win32 API and abstracts away a lot of the nuts and bolts and allows the user to make simple calls. Also does some compression and packing via UPX. This is what the default icon looks like. So when people say, how do you know if you're dealing with an AutoIt? A lot of times they don't even go so far as to change the icon, so that's pretty much a giveaway. Anything else? It's free. That's one of their favorite things, so it's free. That makes it kind of handy. So it does do they have some obfuscation like routines that you can run through it, as well as compiling a wrapper around it so it looks like a standalone binary. So what do we do? The fact that it has to run on a system, we can kind of like walk backwards through the snowshoes, right? Like to the steps in the snow, and kind of reverse what they're doing because it needs to run on these systems. So the first thing we do is we take our bad guy.exe, we unpack it trivially via the command line. There is an MD5 pass hash being used, but it's in a static location, so we can just like pull that out and use it to XOR against the body. Decompress it, detokenize, and then tidy up the code. And if we've done everything properly, we're rewarded with decompiled source. You know, we're not dealing with assembly here. We actually get the source, and you can't really see that, but we blow it up. You basically are reading straight source code, which is great. I mean, this is a quick win. Every time we see one of these, at first it was fun, and after you see it 13, 14 times, it starts getting kind of annoying, and see how fast you get in. Start to stopwatch and see how fast you can reverse it. But we can see here we have SMTP, so we see some possible exfiltration here. We see username and password. We see a port. But at the very top, we see a variable prg equals sr.exe. So it looks like an external program is being called. And to that end,
so I made note that these guys are using stuff that's been around for a while. It looked like they were actually writing their own AutoIt stuff, but they were making use of a couple tools, actually. They're kind of co-patriots in arms, sr.exe and Searcher.dll. Now, Searcher.dll is very straightforward. All it does is any process that it's injected into just looks for credit card data and dumps it to disk. That's all it does. And it does it quite well, actually. sr.exe is kind of the injector. So it's the guy that's saying, look, I want to go after this point of sale.exe, aptly named pos.exe, and I want to inject Searcher into it. So how does it do that, right? And I didn't have a lot of icons. That's not a marshmallow. That's a program. So it looks for kernel32.dll. This is a DLL. It's going to be in any Windows process. It's going to be there. It goes into there and it says, I'm looking for the MZ header of a PE file, right? You're probably familiar with it. You try to run some GUI app in the command line and it says, this program cannot be run in DOS mode, right? So these guys are actually looking for that, and they're overwriting it with the location of Searcher.dll, right? So they say, you don't care, you don't need the MZ, sentence header anymore, so I'm just going to overwrite it with my own stuff. It then says, I'm going to make a call to create remote thread and say, hey, pos.exe, I want you to call load library, and I'm going to use that string that I just overwrit and use that as an argument. So I'm going to load that library. And then from there, it's, game over, and they just start scraping any data that it finds, and it kind of goes from there. So, exfiltration. Now, these guys, it's actually, it's not terribly interesting. They were just, email. It's just in the clear, sending an email. But the kind of interesting note here is where they were sending it to. They actually decided to use a Hotmail account in this case. Now, you might want to bash Microsoft, and it's an easy target. But I think it's fair and truthful to say that those guys have really stepped up their game, at least in the last 5 years, right? They're really being very active in the security community. They got the MAP program. If you saw the previous one, it's got a few quirks where certain people don't play nice, but for the most part, it works really well. And they're taking down botnets, and they're doing a lot of stuff, right? They're helping out. Now, the fact that these guys decided to go with a service out of the many, many services that they could have used, they decided to go with one that will, let's be honest, more often than not, they're gonna work with law enforcement and help out. So the fact that they chose them was kind of interesting. I can't say that I would really make the same decision, just because, I don't know, maybe we know something they don't, but that was the choice they made. So, Pirate Piñata. Where are we looking at here, right? Well, these guys don't have a ton of coding skills. They are writing their own stuff, but it's the equivalent of writing something in BASIC, right? It's not something that's overly complex. They are making full use of known carding tools. These guys are using tools that have been around for years and years, and they work. It's better than the first one, right? Because they do work, and they're not breaking the system, but there's not a lot of sophistication there. And something we hadn't noted, but they used some bash scripts, some batch scripts. And frankly, they were pretty weak. So it was like a 20-line batch script, and they were doing things like saying, I want to run ipconfig with the /help argument, and then I'm going to run it without the help argument, and then I'm going to stop a service, but then I'm going to immediately start it. Then I'm going to run help against my own tool, and then run my tool. We spent like 30 minutes looking at this 20-line bash script because we're like, what the heck are these guys doing?
Mostly spent time laughing, though.
It was pretty funny. It's all about the sophistication.
So from a sophisticated standpoint, at least these guys are writing code, right? I mean, it's something, it's not advanced. And they are using established carding malware, but at least they're only using one. They're not using 5 different ones and causing themselves problems. So from a sophisticated standpoint, not super advanced, but, you know, a step ahead the first one.
How long were they there?
They were there 7 months. And actually, these guys we've seen many, many times, more times than we'd like to admit to. But these guys, on average, we say 7 months, some are longer, some are shorter, but on average, we see them on the system about 7 months.
You can actually probably multiply that by like 10, just because we literally, like Ryan was saying, we're getting kind of sick of seeing this AutoIt stuff. It's really bad. So they're making some money.
Yeah, so with that kind of timeline and and exfiltration, they're basically making a decent amount of money. Where should we plot these guys?
Well, I'm going to go with top left, actually. You know, I don't think they're terribly complex, but obviously they're making some money. They're doing a good job, which is concerning, right? Because you're like, well, wait a minute, these guys aren't smart, and they're making tons and tons of money, more than I make. So, you know, that's kind of an interesting note.
Yeah, you don't have to be the sharpest guy in the room to get a piece of the action. So this brings us to our 4th and final case study for today. This one is called Ewok Tower. The target here is government. We won't say who or what. Method of compromise here is actually email spear phishing, so a bunch of links and attachments were sent out to some very select targets, hoping for them to click on or run the attachments. If that did happen, a remote access Trojan was run on the system. In this case, finally, we do see some anti-reversing techniques being used, and actually a really interesting command and control channel was employed, and then as well as they were using encryption. So a little bit more about the anti-reversing. So like reversing 101, right? Check for debuggers. So if you have a debugger attached, bail out. So easily bypassed, but if you throw in other things in here, such as checking for time deltas, if you have a debugger attached and you bypass is the debugger's present, you're still going to take a little while for that debugger to process versus like the native running on the CPU. So you check those time deltas, now you still know that you're running in a debugger and you bail out again. And also things like checking for sandboxes, right? So you have Norman, for example, has a user that I always use called current user. You can check these types of things. There's other artifacts that are put in place so that the malware checks for these types of artifacts in the system and then takes corresponding action. Hey, I'm in a sandbox, let's do something different to throw them off or just bail again. Another one is looking through the running windows, enumerate the window names and look to see if any security tools are being run. Likewise, in a similar fashion, look at the process being run. Do we see debuggers running? Do we see IDA running? Things that are known tools. If we see these things, take corresponding action. So, I mean, these are pretty rudimentary. They're kind of crude ways of stopping you, but when you sprinkle them out and you do a bunch of them, it just slows down and makes your day that much longer.
You know, it's kind of interesting, right? Because these are actually techniques that we see more often than not in what we like to call like more public samples. Samples like, I don't know, like Zeus, things that are out and about that are expecting to get caught.
Yeah, mass infection.
We don't see this as much in these certain very specific instances, right? So that was kind of a very interesting revelation, I suppose.
Yeah, maybe due to the fact that it was government-based.
Maybe.
Who knows?
So, CNC. So we're looking at this guy, and we're seeing this certain pattern where every 15 minutes it's downloading this wonderful PNG file. So we're like, well, what the heck's going on? Like, obviously something, I mean, maybe they just really like troll faces, but you know, we figured something else was happening. So sure enough, we jump into that image and we take a look at its you know, binary source. And we find this great little interesting string that's kind of buried in at the bottom there. And it might be hard to see, but it's this, right? Now, you know, what is that, right? Base 64. Actually, I noticed there's a defense contractor puzzle on the booklet.
Oh, yeah.
So if you see an equal signs, you know, hint, hint, it's base 64. So sure enough, it's trivial to decode, and you decode it, base64, and you get this wonderful string. It says download underscore, and then like a URL / executable. So we're like, well, that's cool, right? Because that, it's pretty easy to discern what's happening. The first parts before the underscore is the command, and then there's some sort of an option. So we start digging in, and we see these we see these really cryptic terms that are being used. We've got wonderful animations because we're like, these are pretty
Complex issues.
This is kind of a boring slide, so we wanted, jazz it up a little bit. So we got download, we've got execute. They're kind of long animations too. It can take a screenshot, so this is kind of cool. You could specify a resolution option, so if you want a really high-res photo, you can specify like 10. If you want, something that's just cruddy, you're curious if your program's running, you can do like 1. You can upload, which is kind of interesting, right? Because you're like, well, how's it uploading? It's only downloading an image. How is it sending out data? We will talk about that in just a minute. And delete, clean up. And these are just a handful. There was probably like 20 different commands it could take, and it was kind of interesting. So, upload and exfiltration. How's it doing this? Well, first thing it's doing, we're seeing this in these more sort of high-profile attacks. It's encrypting its data. In this case, it's using AES-256, which is great, right? Very, very secure and all. So how are they then exfiltrating? Well, at this point, in my mind, they just completely drop the ball, and they exfiltrate via FTP. And you're probably saying, well, wait, that's clear text. Why are you knocking on these guys? We saw clear text in other cases. They're exfiltrating the data. That's encrypted. What's the big deal? Well, in this case, they put all the usernames, passwords, host names, the whole shebang right in the binary. So, if you're working with law enforcement and you know how they're encrypting data, you can decrypt it. And then you go ahead and you put usernames, passwords, and host names right in your binary. Guess what? Certain people can go in and do stuff if they were so inclined. They could look at what you've gotten. So shame on these guys. I don't like to say I root for bad guys, but I was kind of bummed out that they were doing so well, and then they just misstep. So yeah, the biggest one, FTP. I'm very ashamed of these guys. They should have known better.
So from the sophisticated standpoint, the really cool image command and control, that was pretty interesting. That was a lot of fun. They're using strong encryption, and they threw caltrops throughout the entire binary, so it kind of slowed us down. So from a sophisticated standpoint, that's pretty good.
I agree.
Let's look at the duration and then the profit they're able to get. So in this particular case, they're on the system for a little less than a month, which is, that's a decent amount of time, right, if they're active. But it's kind of difficult to quantify just due to the type of information and who the particular target was in this case. So we say 2. It's a good guess. Best
say
guess
they're
here.
getting like an email, right? What is that worth monetarily? Is it worth $1 or is it worth $1 million?
Right.
Who are we to say? So we just kind of went right down the middle.
$2 out of $3 signs.
Sure.
So we kind of take this all together, and I think they fall on the
Kind of there.
graph about there, right? They're not super advanced, but they're not Babytown Frolics.
They know some stuff. They're making some money, or whatever that would equal for this situation. They're making data.
Yeah, so a few good tricks can go a long way, right? So this kind of brings us to our final tally. So we'll throw up our 4 case studies that we see here. And, they're kind of all over the place, right? It doesn't really make a clear and obvious trend. And, yeah, we did pick these 4 case studies ourselves, but we feel that they're kind of indicative of what we see out there. And with the hundreds and hundreds of breach investigations that we do, we see them all over the place. These are real people. They're out there across the continuum, just like you or I who started our careers, and maybe they start in the bottom left corner and they're working their way up. Maybe they get busted. Maybe they get their big payday and they're out. But it's just this ever-changing environment. You shouldn't be over, what's the word?
Don't
underestimate.
Yeah.
Don't underestimate. Don't overestimate who these guys are and where they're coming at, because they're actually just regular people, and keep that in mind.
not everything's Stuxnet. I mean, not everything's a DDoS. It's the full gamut. And again, this is what we consider to be a targeted case. So, we certainly appreciate your time. We're kind of... 10 minutes. Thank you. We're wrapping up. Before we well, I guess we could take a few questions, but before we do want to say a big thanks to Chris and the rest of the guys organizing this. I've been helping out with the conference back in Chicago. I know how much work it is. I know it's a lot of work. So I certainly thank them for all the hard work that they put in and for bringing us along.